of 30.53. Of this proposed ministerial recurrent budget, over 70% is allocated to 4 ministries of education and skills development, health, local government and rural development, and defense and security. The Ministry of Education is allocated the largest amount of 9.26 billion, or 27.8% of the ministerial recurrent budget, to cater for, among others, additional funds required to implement the regrading exercise for teachers approved by government in 2013, as well as subventions to some parastatals such as the University of Botswana and the Botswana International University of Science and Technology. The Ministry of Health gets the second largest share of 5.22 billion pula, or 15.7% of the ministerial recurrent budget, to cover the cost of additional manpower requirements for new health facilities, ARV therapy, and maintenance of medical equipment and health facilities in order to serve our people accordingly. The Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development receives the third largest share of 4.9 billion, or 14.7%, mainly to cover the terminal benefits for councillors, to augment the maintenance vote for local authorities, maintenance, very important, and the budget for tribal administration. The fourth largest share goes to the Ministry of Defense, Justice and Security, with an amount of 4.18 billion, or 12.5%, to cater for maintenance of equipment and vehicles for security forces, security, very important, as well as for new positions and vehicle replacement. The fifth largest share of the recurrent budget of 1.95, or 5.9%, goes to the Ministry of Transport and Communications to cover, among others, increase in provision of purchase of bulk fuel and lubricants, subventions to Civil Aviation Authority of Botswana, and Bofinet. The other ministries that are allocated significant amounts of ministerial recurrent budget are agriculture at 968.16 million, or 2.9%, State President at 496 million, trade and industry with 871.54 million, youth, sports and culture with 757.31 million, and lands and housing with 735.97 million. The rest of the ministries, Madam Speaker, share the remaining portion of the ministerial recurrent budget. Statutory expenditure, before I deal with development budget. Madam Speaker, in addition to the ministerial recurrent budget, government is obliged to make provisions for payments of statutory expenditure, which are mandated by various statutes. The proposed budget for statutory expenditure is 5.54 billion, which is an increase of 800 million, or 16.9% over the revised budget of 4.74 billion. The increase is due to commencement of principal payments of some of the major loans that we secured during the financial crisis time. So, a government that pays its debts. Development budget. Madam Speaker, the proposed development budget for the 2014-15 financial year is 12.24 billion, albeit a marginal increase over the 2013-14 revised budget. The largest share of the proposed development budget of 3.55 billion, or 29%, is allocated to the Ministry of Minerals, Energy, and Water Resources, as it should be. The major projects, Madam Speaker, that constitute 97.4% of the ministry's budget are Botswana Power Corporation finances at 2.05 billion to cover BPC operational and maintenance costs at 1.15 billion. The Northwest Power Transmission Line that I mentioned earlier at 200 million. Emergency power supplies at 140 million. Rakola substation, 100 million. Murupule A and B at 60 million. North-South water carrier, number 2, from Dikgatlong Dam to Palape, as well as from Palape to Gaborone, 600 million. And completion of Dikgatlong and Tune dams at 200 million and 100 million respectively. Emergency water projects at various locations at 200 million pula. Kanye and Molepolole connection to the North-South water carrier at 100 million. Construction of sewage systems, I'm afraid for Kanye and Molepolole, again, at 80 million, as well as the oil storage project amounting to 50 million. The Ministry of Transport and Communications at 1.875 billion, or 15.3% of the development budget, gets the second largest share. The major projects under this ministry are the ongoing Tonota Francistown Road project at 150 million, Kazungula Bridge at 100 million, cash injection to Air Botswana, our national flag, amounting to 330 million, air transport infrastructure project 390.4 million, and the development of ICT facilities, including broadband and backbone infrastructure, at 300 million. Madam Speaker, the largest development budget, the third largest development budget allocation of 1.271 billion, or 10.4%, goes to the Ministry of Local Government and Rural Development. Among the major programs under the ministry are obviously Ipelecheng at 580.59 million, village infrastructure amounting to 220 million villages to be improved, primary school backlog eradication, very important, at 220 million instead of 10 million of last year, 220 million, as well as fire engines and equipment at 50 million. These projects account for 82.7% of the ministry's development budget. The rest of the ministries, Madam Speaker, share the remaining half of the proposed development budget. Madam Speaker, now that I've completed recurrent and development, I attend to overall balance, projected balance. Madam Speaker, total revenues and grants for the financial year 2014-15 are forecast at 50.18 billion, as I've said before, while its total expenditure and net lending are forecast at 48.857 billion, resulting in an overall budget surplus of 1.326 billion, or 0.97% of forecast 2014-15 GDP. I now turn to fiscal legislation, very important. Madam Speaker, achieving fiscal sustainability in the medium to long term remains one of the government's objectives to create a conducive environment for private sector development in this country. To achieve this, the government will continue to implement the fiscal strategy focusing on 3 areas of expanding the revenue base, restraining overall expenditure, and according priority to quality investments. Madam Speaker, the government continues to make efforts to expand the revenue base and further simplify the tax regime. During the financial year 2014-15, my ministry will present to this House amendments to the Income Tax Act and the VAT Act. Specifically, the VAT Act will be amended to exempt all farming equipment and all basic foodstuffs which are currently zero-rated. To encourage intake of balanced meals for families, the list of basic foodstuffs will be increased to include, among others, vegetables, rice, and milk. In addition, Madam Speaker, the VAT registration threshold will be increased from the current 500,000 pula to 1 million pula in order to relieve small taxpayers of the burden of regularly filing VAT returns. These amendments, Madam Speaker, are geared towards simplification of the tax laws and tax administration and to encourage compliance. We will also present to this House amendments to the Transfer Duty Act, which would be meant to encourage home ownership, especially by first-time homeowners. Madam Speaker, paragraph here for the information of the public on process regarding the subject I'll be talking about here. Madam Speaker, as I mentioned in the 2011 budget speech, the adoption of the Public Service Act of 2008 shifted advice on the determination of public service salaries increase from the National Employment Manpower Incomes Council, NEMIC, to the Public Service Bargaining Council, made up of representatives of government as the employer and public service trade unions representing the employees. Consequently, Madam Speaker, government is not in a position to make an announcement on public service salaries at this stage. Therefore, Madam Speaker, we urge the Bargaining Council to proceed expeditiously with salary negotiations for the 2014-15 financial year. Of course, taking into account the budgetary constraints imposed by uncertainties in the economic outlook of both the global and domestic economies, as stated earlier in the speech. Conclusion. Madam Speaker, this budget before you has been prepared in the context of uncertainties regarding the recovery of the global economy. Besides these uncertainties, our economic review and outlook point to the fact that Botswana was able to contain the effects of the global financial crisis reasonably well, largely because we were able to draw down on our accumulated government balances and borrow from the domestic and international capital markets using our good credit rating. However, in the process, we ran significant deficits for the first 3 years since the crisis. Going forward, government intends to run moderate surpluses, which should enable us to restore those balances and repay government debts. And I believe my report on 2012-13, 2013-14, and 2014-15 attested to what I've just said. Going forward, the government intends to run moderate surpluses, which should enable us to restore those balances and repay accumulated debts. Hence, Madam Speaker, the government's economic strategy in the face of uncertain global economy is to promote the development of private sector activities by maintaining macroeconomic stability, very important, investing in high return projects, and undertaking structural reforms to promote efficiency throughout the economy. By extension, our fiscal strategy recognizes that two of our main revenue sources, namely minerals and SACU revenues, are volatile and will ultimately decline as a share of GDP. These facts have two major implications. First, in any given year, we must set government expenditure at sustainable level and not necessarily spend every pula of available revenues. Second, we must ensure that the fundamental revenue base is not eroded by dispensations such as special concessions and/or tax holidays, unless these are effectively result in increased job creation opportunities and revenue generation. At the same time, the government is committed to streamlining the tax system so that, as far as possible, every taxpayer finds it easy and simple to comply with his or her tax obligations. Madam Speaker, I wish to underscore the point that the development budget for 2014-15 of 12.24 billion pula is a significant amount to be spent in a single year. A substantial part of this amount will be spent on mega programs such as primary schools, backlog eradication, as I mentioned before, which I'm happy to say will take place throughout the country. The North-South Water Carrier, Phase 2, the Northwest Transmission Line. This is an effort on the part of the government, Madam Speaker, to further stimulate the economy, and it is indeed a great opportunity for the private sector, I would like to suggest, to take advantage of this government initiative. Madam Speaker, before I conclude, I would like to express my appreciation on behalf of the government for the valuable assistance offered by our bilateral and multilateral development partners, as well as private foundations. Their technical and financial support towards achieving our development initiatives will continue to be essential in enhancing the livelihoods of Botswana, which is a major objective of the current government. Madam Speaker, I now move that the appropriation 2014-2015 bill 2014, number 1 of 2014, be read a second time, and I thank you for your attention.
Please take your seat. Take your seat, Minister. Let them not delay you. I'm waiting for you to sit down. Order. Thank you, Minister. Honorable members, the Minister of Finance and Development Planning has moved that the appropriation 2014-2015 bill 2014 number 1 of 2014 be read a second time. Now, honorable members, in terms of standing orders number 86.2, after the motion for the second reading of the appropriation bill has been proposed, the debate thereon shall not commence until one clear day has elapsed, and thereafter not more than 10 further days shall be allocated to the second reading of the bill. Therefore, the debate on the second reading will commence on Wednesday, the 5th of February 2014. Now, I shall send communication to you tomorrow, honorable members, pertaining to allocated speaking time for all members of parliament. After consultation with the Business and Advisory Committee in the normal manner. In that regard, I request members of the Business and Advisory Committee to come for our usual meeting tomorrow morning at 8:30 in my chambers. And we have to do that before we can even call the General Assembly. For the information of our guests, copies of the budget speech will be distributed to all of you honorable members and our guests as you leave the chambers. Now, we have prepared snacks and teas for our guests and you honorable members outside on the grounds of Parliament as usual. Ka Setswana metsinyana a teng bagolo lona mo lo ise lo tsamaye. That concludes the business on today's order paper, and I have the honor to call upon His Honor the Vice President and Leader of this House to move adjournment. Honorable Leader of the House.
Madam Speaker, I beg to move that this House do now adjourn.
The Leader of the House has moved. The question is that this House do now adjourn, honorable members. The question is that this House do now adjourn. As many as are of that opinion say aye. Aye. On the contrary, say no. No. Well, the ayes have it. The ayes have it, and it is so decided. Thank you very much.
Ke gone jaaka re sa tswa go bona mo nakong hele re sa tswang metsotswana re tswang mo gone re utlwa jalo pego ya kabo ya madi ya ngwaga wa 2014-2015 ka tona Kenneth Mathambo ga ke itse ga itsile ke gona le sepehela se se go gakgamaditseng ka seno sa se sologela mo pegong ya monongwaga
ga itse ka ga go kgomiwa banana thata mme ke tsa gore thuto go ngwetla le bagana le banana ka tsela nngwe mme hela tumelo me go gone gore ka ga leng gore go kgagantse madi a teng ka teng ke se ne re ntse re se sologetse re buile mo dibekeng tse di heta go builwe gantsi ntse gore madi a go hela ile go thutong se go le bogolo HRDC ntse simolosiwa BQA e simolositswe bo TEC ba sutlilwe madi ntse ra nna mantsi gone go le gone hela go tlhabolla kgotsa go booster bana ba ba kgona go dira primary school ba busile tsena mo sekolong ke nngwe di gantsi le gore ne re soletse 27.8%.
go ntse hela jalo we tshoketsa gore ya ka re sa tswa go utlwa tota kgangkgolo ke gone go tsweledisa di-project tse e leng gore di ntse di tshwerwe le gone go maintaina tse e leng gore di ntse di le teng madi ga a kalokalo a e leng gore go ka dirwa sepe se sešwa jaaka o itse gore one mahatshe a re a ikegile mo go one a re ikegileng ka one tota a tlhabologileng itsholela a one tota ga ise